Burmese pythons have transformed the entire ecosystem of South Florida. And the only way to find out, well, is to catch them.
This is actually the one that bit me, that I almost
God.
bled out in the middle of the Everglades, caught by myself in the middle of the Everglades.
Oh my God, dude.
And
that bit you?
Yeah. And this snake, 17 foot 7 inches.
In Florida's Everglades, the story was always clear. The Burmese python was the monster, and its war belonged in the wild swamps. An ecological tragedy kept safely on the other side of the canals. However, recent footage from security cameras in quiet suburbs tells a completely different and chilling story, showing these enormous predators not in a panicked retreat, but calmly emerging from canals and methodically probing the edges of our neighborhoods as if scouting new territory. Why are they suddenly abandoning the wilderness they already conquered? What hunger is now driving them closer to our homes? And if the complete destruction of an ecosystem was what we feared, then what is the far worse reality these cameras are now exposing? The breach. When the battleground moves. A battle between titans unfolded, not in the murky, untamed heart of the Florida Everglades, but on the impossibly green, perfectly manicured fairway of the 10th hole at the Fiddler's Creek Golf Club in Naples. A Burmese python, a creature of shadow and ambush, was locked in a mortal struggle with a young alligator, its powerful coils churning the otherwise serene water of a man-made hazard. The raw, violent spectacle was shocking enough, captured in a viral video that spread like wildfire. But the true horror of the event was not the fight itself, but its location. For decades, the python invasion has been framed as an ecological war contained within the vast, wild borders of the swamp, a tragic but distant problem for park rangers and biologists to manage. This single event, however, demonstrated with brutal clarity that the war was no longer staying within its designated battlefield. The invisible line separating the chaos of the wild from the order of human civilization had been decisively crossed. This was not a simple case of an animal getting lost and wandering into the wrong place. The calculated presence of a major apex predator, actively hunting in a space designed exclusively for human leisure, represented something far more systematic. A fundamental shift in the conflict. The fight itself was almost irrelevant. What mattered was that it happened there at all. It served as a public announcement that the rules of engagement had changed. The problems that were once confined to the remote wilderness, documented only by hidden wildlife cameras, were now playing out in plain sight, on the very grounds where people lived and played. The barrier that was supposed to keep the nightmare contained had proven to be little more than an illusion, easily breached by a predator that was clearly operating under a new and desperate set of motivations. This was not a random encounter. It was a sign, a clear and undeniable omen of a forced migration, a desperate exodus that scientists had been quietly fearing for years, driven by a catastrophe that had already reached its conclusion deep within the swamp. The feast is over. A land of ghosts. To comprehend the python's desperate gamble at the golf course, one must first journey back to the world it was forced to abandon. A world that is no longer the teeming paradise of popular imagination, but something far more unsettling. When wildlife cameras peer into the deep interior of Everglades National Park today, they do not capture a vibrant ecosystem bursting with life. Instead, they record a profound and unnatural silence. The constant rustle of small mammals in the undergrowth has vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. This is not a feeling or a guess. It is a quantifiable reality confirmed by the exhaustive research of the U.S. Geological Survey. Their findings paint a picture of a systematic annihilation, a biological void where a complex community once thrived. In the core areas of the python invasion, the populations of raccoons and opossums have not just been reduced, they have been effectively erased. with declines measured at over 98%. The marsh rabbits and native foxes that once populated these lands are now little more than ghosts in the historical data. The python, with its voracious efficiency, has done more than just disrupt the food chain. It has surgically dismantled it, consuming the middle tier of the ecosystem until almost nothing remains. The Everglades, for this invasive predator, is no longer a bountiful hunting ground overflowing with endless opportunity. It has become an ecological ghost town, a vast and empty refrigerator that has been stripped bare by its most successful inhabitant. This catastrophic success has created an entirely new and far more urgent crisis. A problem no longer defined by what the pythons are eating, but by the terrifying question of what they will do now that the feast is finally over. An army of hundreds of thousands of the planet's most ruthlessly efficient predators is now trapped in a barren wasteland of its own creation. And a hungry predator, driven by the most powerful instinct of all, will never, ever sit still. Assembling an army. The architects of disaster. This invasive army was not born from the natural processes of the swamp. It was meticulously assembled, piece by piece, through the careless choices of human hands. The story of its creation begins in the suburbs of the 1980s and 90s, fueled by a booming exotic pet trade that presented these powerful constrictors as novelties, sold when they were small and manageable. When these pets inevitably grew into formidable giants, too large and expensive to care for, many owners made the fateful decision to release them into the nearby wetlands, seeding the initial invasion. This slow trickle of released animals was then supercharged into a deluge by a single, cataclysmic event: the fury of Hurricane Andrew in 1992. The storm's destructive power tore apart a reptile breeding facility near the Everglades, unleashing hundreds more pythons directly into an environment perfectly suited for their survival. From these initial seeding events, in a warm climate with no natural predators and a seemingly infinite supply of unsuspecting prey, the python population did not just grow, it exploded into a colossal force. Current scientific estimates, while difficult to confirm with absolute certainty, place their numbers as high as 300,000. It is critical to understand that Florida is not dealing with a few isolated monster snakes, but with a deeply entrenched, self-sustaining population of immense size for decades. This massive army thrived quietly, waging a devastatingly effective war of attrition against the native wildlife, all while remaining largely invisible. Now, however, the very success that allowed them to multiply to such staggering numbers has become their greatest vulnerability, as the vast food supply they relied upon has finally collapsed under their own weight. Ecologists understand a fundamental rule of nature. When a predator population of this density completely exhausts its resources, only two outcomes are possible: a mass die-off from starvation, or a mass migration. The data now emerging from the cameras suggests they have already chosen the second option: quantitative evidence. The new highways, the definitive proof of this mass migration, is not found in scattered anecdotes, but in the cold, hard data streaming from the very tools that first documented the swamp's collapse. The extensive networks of motion-triggered cameras, originally deployed by the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission and the USGS to measure the heartbreaking absence of native animals, are now capturing a new and deeply disturbing trend. Their digital eyes are recording a sharp, statistically significant increase in python activity, not in the depleted interior, but along the vulnerable periphery of the national park. The data reveals a clear directional pattern, a steady outward pressure that is pushing these predators toward the park's boundaries. The scientists are no longer just tracking trails through the forest. They are now monitoring what they have come to call python highways, a vast grid of man-made canals and levees built to control water and manage the landscape for human benefit. These artificial waterways, designed by engineers for drainage and irrigation, have been repurposed by a highly adaptable predator into a perfect transportation network. The pythons are using these deep, straight channels to travel with unparalleled speed and efficiency, bypassing miles of difficult terrain and moving with a clear sense of purpose. This is not a random dispersal. It is a methodical and strategic expansion, facilitated by the very structures that were meant to separate the wild lands from developed areas. The cameras are providing a real-time map of this invasion, showing the steady, relentless advance of an army that has discovered the perfect logistical system for its next campaign. A system that was unwittingly built for them. These canals, however, do not just connect one part of the wilderness to another. They flow directly into the backyards, the agricultural lands, and the residential water systems of South Florida. The python is not just moving, it is using our own infrastructure as its primary weapon of invasion. Profile of the migrant. Nothing left to lose. It is a grave mistake to confuse a hungry python with a weak one. The creatures now embarking on this forced migration are not frail or diminished. They are the hardened survivors of a brutal ecological collapse, representing the most resilient and formidable members of their species. These are biological machines perfected for survival, capable of enduring for months without a single meal, all while losing very little of their immense strength. When these patient predators finally decide to strike, their power is absolute, and virtually nothing is off-limits. Scientific records document a 15-foot python consuming a 77-pound deer, a testament to their incredible capacity for taking down prey far larger than themselves. They are adept swimmers, skilled climbers, and masters of camouflage, able to blend into nearly any environment and wait with near-infinite patience for an opportunity. Now, this army of tens of thousands of perfect survivalists has been unleashed from the confines of the Everglades, propelled outward by the unrelenting pressure of starvation. They are no longer bound by the predictable patterns of a well-fed predator defending its territory. Instead, they are operating under a far more dangerous and unpredictable directive: the desperate, all-consuming search for calories, wherever they can be found. This desperation does not make them weaker. It strips away their selectivity. The cautious calculations of a predator with many options have been replaced by the bold opportunism of a creature with nothing left to lose. They are now exploring a completely new environment, a landscape filled with novel sights and sounds, driven by a singular, primal objective. Desperation has not weakened them. It has only removed their inhibitions. And they are not the only apex predators being forced out of their home. The dual exodus, dangerous refugees. The python's relentless invasion has not created a single migrant, but two. The native king of the Everglades, the American alligator, is also being systematically displaced, becoming a dangerous refugee in its own kingdom. Biologists with the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission are observing disturbing changes in the alligator populations trapped within the python's expanding territory. These ancient predators are not just visibly thinner, a direct consequence of the pythons having consumed their primary food sources, but they are also exhibiting uncharacteristic levels of aggression. The constant competition for a vanishingly small pool of resources has turned the swamp into a pressure cooker, pushing the alligators to become more desperate and far less predictable in their behavior, driven from their ancestral hunting grounds by a foreign usurper. They too are on the move, following the same paths of least resistance out of the depleted wetlands. The result is a terrifying and unprecedented ecological scenario: a dual exodus of two apex predators. Both the invasive constrictor and the native behemoth are being funneled by environmental pressures into the same limited spaces at the edge of human civilization. The suburban ponds, agricultural canals, and golf course water hazards that mark the border between the wild and the developed world have now become a tense and overcrowded refugee camp for the most powerful creatures in Florida. The delicate balance of the swamp has been shattered, and the resulting chaos is now spilling over the artificial boundaries we believed would keep us safe. We are no longer witnessing a distant conflict between two species, but are instead caught in the crossfire of their escalating war for survival. The sharp increase in official reports of nuisance alligators is no longer a mystery. Perhaps they are not a nuisance at all. Perhaps they are simply refugees, fleeing a crisis we failed to contain, and are now seeking asylum in the only territory left available to them. When the wilderness knocks. Stories from the edge. The fear was no longer an abstract number on a biologist's chart or a distant blip on a wildlife camera. It had become a visceral, tangible presence, infiltrating the carefully constructed sanctuaries of everyday life. And its arrival was being announced through a growing chorus of unsettling human encounters. It was the chilling account from a homeowner in Homestead who discovered a 10-foot python coiled beneath the warm hum of an air conditioning unit, seeking refuge not in the wild, but in the very heart of human infrastructure. It was the quiet heartbreak from a resident in Loxahatchee, whose beloved pet dog vanished without a trace from a securely fenced backyard, leaving behind only an unsettling silence where life once was. It was the massive, heavy drag marks found pressed into the soft mud beside a residential boat dock after a rainy night, the unmistakable signature of a truly enormous creature having passed through a space reserved for family recreation. These are not isolated incidents or freak occurrences. They are data points of an entirely different nature, markers of a front line that has moved from the swamp to the suburbs. Each story confirms that the boundary between our world and theirs, a line we once thought was clear and defined by roads and canals, has been completely and irrevocably erased. The methodical advance that the wildlife cameras had been tracking in the wilderness was now being confirmed by the most reliable sensors of all: ordinary people, who were suddenly finding themselves living inside the hunting grounds of a desperate and powerful predator. The wilderness was no longer a place one could visit. It was now a force that could visit you. For years, the people of Florida had learned to live alongside the wildness at their doorstep, respecting an invisible boundary. But they were never prepared to face a wilderness that was no longer just existing beside them, but was now actively probing their defenses. That all changed the night a simple home security camera recorded the moment the probing ended, and the hunt truly began. The smoking gun, an undeniable recording. This was not another blurry, ambiguous shape captured by a motion sensor deep in the wilderness, open to interpretation and debate. This was a crystal-clear, high-definition video, recorded under the sterile blue glow of a Ring security camera mounted on a quiet suburban home in the town of Davie. At 17 minutes past 2 in the morning, a large Burmese python emerged from the shadows of the manicured shrubbery. It moved with a slow, deliberate confidence across the lawn, heading directly for the glass patio door at the back of the house. It did not simply pass by on a random journey. It stopped. It raised the front third of its body, its dark eyes unblinking, and for nearly a full minute, it appeared to be observing the interior of the home, where a house cat was sleeping peacefully on a sofa, completely unaware of the immense predator just a few feet away. This was not the behavior of a migrating animal simply following a path. This was the methodical assessment of a potential hunting ground. It was a calculated probe, an evaluation of a new and promising source of food, conducted with the chilling patience that only a top predator possesses. The video provided the undeniable smoking gun that every scientist and wildlife officer had been dreading. It confirmed that the pythons were not just accidentally stumbling into residential areas as a consequence of their exodus from the swamp. They were actively beginning to identify human homes as places of opportunity, associating the lights, the structures, and the presence of smaller animals with the potential for a meal. The invisible barrier between their world and ours had not just been breached, it was now being actively targeted. This undeniable footage was immediately forwarded to the leading experts on invasive species, and their formal interpretation of what they saw was, somehow, even more disturbing than the video itself. Expert analysis. Phase 2 has begun when behavioral biologists reviewed the footage from the Davy home. Their conclusions were unanimous and delivered a stark, chilling verdict. The python in the video was not exhibiting defensive posturing, nor was it engaged in random, disoriented wandering. It was displaying what they formally identified as opportunistic, exploratory hunting behavior. They declared this moment the definitive start of Phase 2 of the Floridian python invasion. Phase 1, they explained, was the ecological annihilation of the Everglades, a war fought against native wildlife in a remote, natural setting. That phase, they concluded, is now largely over. Phase 2 is the subsequent adaptation and systematic exploitation of artificial, human-created environments. The battleground has officially shifted from the swamp to the suburbs. The experts warned that this was not a one-time event, but the beginning of a learned behavior that could spread throughout the migrating population. Pythons are remarkably intelligent creatures, capable of recognizing patterns and associating specific environments with reliable food sources. As more of these hungry predators are forced to the edges of our communities, they will inevitably begin to view our pets, our ornamental birds, our discarded food, and even our water features not as obstacles, but as resources. The experts outlined a predictable progression, a learning curve where the pythons would quickly become more efficient and bolder in their exploitation of these new, calorie-rich territories. They were no longer just ecological invaders. They were becoming an urbanized predator. The fear is not that they will come. The fear, confirmed by the experts, is that they are already here, and they are learning. This raises the most urgent question of all. How do you fight back against an enemy that has completely changed the rules of the game? The new front line. A war on new terms. The fight against the Burmese python is no longer a battle waged exclusively by biologists in airboats. Deep within the sawgrass prairies of the Everglades, the confirmation of Phase 2 has forced a dramatic and urgent shift in strategy, moving the front line of the war from the wilderness to the water culverts of suburban developments. Specialized programs like the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission's Python Action Team, once focused on remote wetlands, now find themselves patrolling the manicured banks of urban canals and responding to calls from gated communities. The official guidance from state agencies has changed, with public service announcements no longer just educating about ecological impacts, but issuing stark warnings to residents about securing pets, eliminating potential hiding spots like brush piles, and reinforcing enclosures for backyard animals. The famous Florida Python Challenge, an annual event designed to remove pythons and raise awareness, has also adapted to this new reality. The boundaries of the competition have expanded to include water management districts and public lands that directly border residential zones, with special incentives now offered for pythons captured in these newly designated high-risk areas. This is no longer just a conservation effort aimed at protecting a national park. It has become a large-scale defensive operation, a community-wide mobilization to protect the human environment itself. Every homeowner living on the edge of a canal, every groundskeeper at a golf course, every officer on patrol has unwittingly become a soldier in a war they never signed up for, fighting to hold a line that was never supposed to exist in the first place. Humanity has removed more than 15,000 pythons from the ecosystem through these combined, exhaustive efforts. But every expert agrees that this is only a fraction of the total population. Despite every snake caught, despite every dollar spent, The hungry army continues its methodical advance. This relentless pressure leads to the final, and most unsettling, question of all: the true boundary. An illusion shattered, so. What was the far worse reality that the cameras ultimately exposed? It was not the confirmation of a bigger, more monstrous python lurking in the shadows. It was the complete and final collapse of a comforting illusion. The deeply held belief that the ecological disasters we create will politely remain within the wild spaces we assign to them. The truth is that the Everglades is no longer functioning as a cage to contain the monster. For decades, it served as a cradle, a perfect incubator that allowed the creature to grow in number and strength. It then became a training ground, a brutal arena that honed its survival skills. And now, it is serving as a launching pad, a staging ground from which that very same monster can push into the human world. The war is no longer about saving the Everglades. The war is now about preventing the Everglades from spilling over into the rest of Florida. The footage from the security camera did not just show a snake at a glass door. It showed the shattering of our most fundamental assumption about the separation between our world and theirs. We built our civilization right up to the edge of one of the planet's most formidable wildernesses, confident that our roads, canals, and manicured lawns formed a permanent and reliable boundary. We believed that we were the ones defining the terms of engagement, that the wild would stop where our pavement began. But the python, operating under the simple, unforgiving laws of hunger and survival, has taught us a terrifying lesson. A predator with nothing left to lose does not see a boundary. It sees an invitation,